What if one of the biggest misunderstandings of modern faith is the idea that Jesus came to save you from the very commandments his Father called holy, good, and life-giving? Millions of believers love Jesus deeply, yet the moment they begin asking about the Torah, the Sabbath, the biblical feasts, or the commandments of God, they are often warned to stop. That is legalism. That is bondage. That was nailed to the cross. But then a problem appears. Jesus himself said, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets." Not only that, but the new covenant does not say God will erase his Torah. It says, "I will put my law within them, and on their heart I will write it." So what is really going on here? Did Yeshua cancel the commandments? Or did later generations learn to read him that way? And what did Paul actually mean in the passages that seem to say the opposite? In this video, we are going to face that question directly. We will look at the words of Jesus, the difficult writings of Paul, the meaning of the new covenant, and the practical first steps for believers who feel called to return to the roots without falling into fear, pride, or dead religion. Because this is not just a theological debate, it is a question of identity. If Jesus did not abolish the Torah, then many believers may have inherited a version of faith that has been disconnected from its own roots. And if that is true, then returning to the roots is not going backward. It is finally beginning to understand the faith the way it was meant to be understood. There is a growing tension inside the lives of many sincere believers, and it usually does not begin with rebellion. It begins with a question. A person loves Jesus, trusts him, reads the New Testament, and yet slowly starts to feel that something does not fully fit. The deeper they look into the life of Yeshua, the more they see a Jewish Messiah who loved the Scriptures, honored the Father's commandments, lived inside the rhythm of Sabbath and appointed times, and never spoke like the Torah was a burden to escape. But then they look at modern Christianity and see a very different message, a message that often treats the commandments of God as a finished problem, something old, something dangerous, something that threatens grace if taken too seriously. That is where the inner conflict begins. Because now the believer is caught between two fears. On one side is the fear of legalism. On the other side is the fear of ignoring something God still cares about. One voice says, "Do not go back there, that is bondage." Another voice says, "If you really love God, why are you still disconnected from his ways?" And right in the middle stands the honest disciple who is not trying to earn salvation, not trying to impress anyone, not trying to perform a new identity, but simply trying to understand whether the roots of the faith still matter. That is why this issue is so powerful. It is not merely about theology, it is about identity. Did the coming of Jesus create a brand new religion, cut off from Israel, cut off from Torah, cut off from the covenant story that came before? Or were the first believers actually living inside the same story, now brought into its fullness through the Messiah? Paul says in Romans chapter 11 that Gentile believers are grafted into an existing olive tree, not planted as a separate one. That image matters. A branch does not replace the roots, it draws life from them. And that is exactly why so many believers today feel this ache. They have been told to love Jesus, but often without his historical world, without his covenant context, and without the biblical patterns that shape the lives of his first disciples. So the real crisis is deeper than, should I keep this commandment or that one? The deeper crisis is this: have we inherited a version of faith that separated the Messiah from his own roots and then taught us to call that maturity? Because if that happened, then the return to the roots is not extremism, it is not regression, it is the beginning of honesty. It is the moment a believer stops repeating slogans and starts asking whether the God who once called his commandments holy, wise, and good has really changed, or whether we have simply learned to read the story through a lens that no longer sounds like the world of Jesus at all. If we want a serious answer to this question, we have to begin with Jesus himself, not with assumptions, not with later traditions, and not with verses from Paul pulled out of context. And when we begin with Jesus, the first thing we hear is not a hint, but a warning. Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. That sentence matters because it shows that Jesus already knew people would be tempted to misunderstand him. He knew his authority, his confrontations with the religious leaders, and his radical teaching would make some assume he had come to tear down what came before. So he stops that idea at the door. Do not think that. Then he says, I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. In modern ears, fulfill is often treated as if it means finish and remove. But that creates a serious problem, because then Jesus would basically be saying, I did not abolish it, I only made it disappear in a more polite way. That weakens his whole point. Commandments. No, what Jesus is doing is far deeper. He is saying that he did not come to destroy God's instruction, but to bring it into its full meaning, its true depth, its proper expression. And that is exactly what we see throughout his ministry. Jesus never treated the Torah as the enemy. He treated human distortion as the enemy. His conflict was not with the commandments of God, but with the way people used religion to hide from the heart of God. When he rebuked certain Pharisees, he was not attacking obedience itself. He was attacking hypocrisy, selective obedience, and man-made tradition that had begun to overshadow the commandment of God. In Mark chapter 7, verse 8, he says, You neglect the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. That is not the voice of someone trying to free people from the Torah. That is the voice of someone defending God's word from people who had covered it with human control. The same pattern appears in the way Jesus handled the Sabbath. He never said the Sabbath was canceled. He never told his followers to ignore it. Instead, he said, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. That is a correction, not a cancellation. He was restoring the Sabbath to its original purpose as a gift, not a weapon. It was made for life, rest, trust, and holy rhythm, not for crushing people under religious pressure. And the same thing happens in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard, but I say to you, is often misunderstood as Jesus replacing Moses. But he is not correcting the Torah. He is correcting shallow readings of it. He takes commands against murder and shows they reach into anger. He takes commands against adultery and shows they reach into desire. He drives the commandments deeper into the heart instead of lowering them. In other words, Jesus does not reduce the Torah. He intensifies it. He reveals its true weight. That is why Matthew chapter 5 verse 19 is so important. Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. That does not sound like a man announcing the end of God's instruction. It sounds like a king deeply concerned with how God's commandments are handled in his kingdom. So the great correction is this. Jesus did not come to rescue people from the Torah. He came to rescue the Torah from distortion. He came to reveal its heart, defend its truth, and expose the false religion that had grown around it. And once you see that, the whole discussion changes because now the Torah is no longer the problem. The problem is whether we have inherited a version of faith that confuses Jesus, correction of abuse, with a cancellation of God's commandments. This is where many believers feel the tension the most, because no one is quoted more often against the Torah than Paul. People hear verses from Galatians, Colossians, and Romans and assume the matter is settled. They are told that Paul broke completely with Moses, that he taught believers to leave the commandments behind, and that returning to the roots is a denial of grace. But the first thing we need to remember is that Scripture itself warns us to read Paul carefully. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter says that Paul wrote things that are hard to understand, and that unstable people twist his words to their own destruction. That warning matters. It means that when Paul sounds confusing, the safest response is not speed, but caution. And once we slow down, something important becomes clear. Paul never speaks of God's law as if it were evil. In Romans chapter 7 verse 12 he says, So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. In Romans chapter 3 verse 31 he says, Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law. Those are not the words of a man trying to destroy the Torah. So what is Paul actually fighting? He is fighting the misuse of Torah as a system of self-justification. He is fighting the idea that a person can be declared righteous before God through works, flesh, status, or religious performance. That is especially clear in Galatians. Paul is not attacking obedience itself. He is attacking a false gospel that tells people they must secure covenant standing through ritual identity markers rather than through faith in Messiah. The problem is not God's instruction. The problem is using God's instruction as a ladder to climb into salvation. That is why phrases like under the law should not be treated as if they simply mean trying to obey God. Paul's concern is with condemnation, fleshly boasting, and a wrong use of Torah, not with the idea that God's commandments suddenly became meaningless. The same caution is needed in Colossians chapter 2. Many people quote it as proof that Sabbaths, feasts, and biblical practices are over. But Paul does not say, do not practice these things. He says, "Let no one judge you," regarding food, drink, festival, new moon, or Sabbaths. In other words, the pressure in that passage is not coming from Torah itself, but from people using these matters to condemn or control others. And when Paul says these things are a shadow of what is connected to Messiah, that does not make them worthless. A shadow points to something real. It teaches shape. It directs the eye. So the real issue is not that Paul abolished the roots. The real issue is that many people read Paul as if he were fighting against the same scriptures he called holy, righteous, and good. He was not preaching lawlessness. He was defending the right order. Salvation by grace, no boasting in the flesh, and a life that flows from Messiah rather than from self-righteous striving. Once you see that, Paul stops being the apostle of disconnection and becomes something much more challenging. He becomes the man who refuses to let you turn obedience into pride, but also refuses to let you turn grace into an excuse for distance from the ways of God. Many believers hear the phrase New Covenant and immediately assume it means new rules, new identity, and a complete break from what came before. But that is not how the prophets describe it. In Jeremiah 31, the promise of the New Covenant is not that God will erase his Torah. It is that he will write it on the heart. That changes everything. The problem was never that God's commandments were bad. The problem was the human heart. Israel could receive holy instruction and still remain stubborn, broken, and resistant within. So what is new in the New Covenant? Not a new God and not a new morality, but a new level of inward transformation. Ezekiel says the same thing. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes. The Spirit is not given so that obedience becomes irrelevant. The Spirit is given so that obedience becomes possible from the inside out. That means grace and Torah are not enemies. Grace is not God lowering the standard. Grace is God changing the person. He does not say, you failed, so my ways no longer matter. He says, you failed, so I will work within you. That is why the New Covenant should not be understood as freedom from God's instruction, but as freedom from the hard heart that could never truly delight in it. The goal is not less holiness, but deeper holiness. Not outward performance alone, but inward alignment with the will of God. So when Yeshua speaks to the heart, and when the Spirit leads believers into truth, this is not a departure from Torah. It is the deepest expression of what Torah was always meant to produce, a people whose obedience flows from love, trust, and the transforming work of God within. At this point, the question becomes practical. If Jesus did not abolish the Torah, and if the New Covenant writes God's instruction on the heart, then how should a believer respond? Not with panic, not with performance, and not with a desperate attempt to change everything overnight. The first step is not to build a new religious costume. The first step is to slow down and begin reading Scripture with new honesty. Start where God starts. Look again at the Sabbath, not first as a list of restrictions, but as a gift of rest, trust, and holy time. Look again at the appointed times of the Lord, not as strange Jewish customs, but as moments in God's calendar that reveal His redemptive pattern. Look again at the commandments, not as a way to earn salvation, but as a way of learning the heart of the God who saved you. This matters, because many believers make one of two mistakes. Some are so afraid of legalism that they avoid obedience altogether. Others become so excited about the roots that they turn obedience into a measure of worth. Both errors are dangerous. The goal is not fear-driven religion, and it is not pride-driven identity. The goal is faithfulness born from love. That means returning to the roots should look like humility, patience, and growth. You may begin by setting apart Sabbath time, by studying the feasts, by asking serious questions about biblical patterns of holiness, and by seeking community with others who are walking the same road. But through all of it, you must remember the right order. We do not obey in order to be saved. We obey because God has already shown mercy in Messiah. A practical return to the roots is not about becoming more impressive. It is about becoming more aligned. It is the quiet decision to stop treating God's ways as irrelevant and to begin treating them once again as wise, beautiful, and worthy of serious attention. But before we end, one final warning is necessary. Because many believers who begin this journey make the mistake of assuming that once they see a distortion, every opposite reaction must be truth. That is not wisdom. It is just another trap. Yes, many people were taught a version of faith that cut Jesus off from his roots, treated the Torah like a burden, and turned grace into distance from the commandments of God. But the answer to that distortion is not to swing into pride, pressure, or a new form of religious performance. The moment obedience becomes a way to measure your superiority, the roots are already being poisoned. The moment Sabbath, food, or biblical practice becomes a badge for judging others, you are no longer recovering the heart of God. You are rebuilding the very kind of distortion Jesus confronted. The goal is not to become more Torah than everyone else. The goal is to become more honest, more humble, and more aligned with the God of Israel through Messiah. That means we must reject both errors. The error that says obedience no longer matters, and the error that turns obedience into identity theater. The narrow path is harder than both. It requires grace without lawlessness and obedience without pride. It requires a heart that loves truth more than appearance. So the real invitation of this message is not simply go keep more commandments. The real invitation is this: return to the roots with a clean heart. Let the words of Jesus speak louder than religious slogans. Let the writings of Paul be read carefully, not weaponized carelessly. Let the new covenant mean what the prophets said it means: God writing his instruction on the heart of his people. And then begin walking, slowly, honestly, and faithfully. Because returning to the roots is not going backward. It is stepping closer to the original shape of the faith. And the question now is not whether the roots are still there. The question is whether you are willing to stop being afraid of them. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching and being part of this journey with me. Now I invite you to check out this recommended video right here. And if you're hungry for more eye-opening content, hit the subscribe button and let's keep learning together.